and welcome to our offshore diving chat today with Elitza Germanov. She's a passionate diver with a huge love for the ocean and also a senior scientist at Marine Megafauna Foundation. She's an expert in microplastic and spent a lot of time here in Indonesia before doing her research about the impact of microplastic in the marine environment on filter feeding animals such as whale sharks and manta rays. Today, she's in Canada and we're having a Zoom meeting with her. Hi, Ellie. How are you?
I'm good. Thanks for the opportunity to chat.
Thank you so much for having an interview with us today. And let's talk a little bit about your research. So, while you were diving here in Asia, you also encountered manta rays. Can you tell us a little bit more about your fascination for these animals and what made you start researching more about them?
Sure. Yeah, so you're right. I didn't come to Indonesia as a marine researcher. In fact, my experience in Indonesia changed my career trajectory completely. I first came here on a holiday and I was already quite involved in diving at that time, but it was really a trip to Komodo National Park where we encountered maybe 100 manta rays in one dive. And that just really changed the way that I see interacting with large marine animals, because they were just completely uninterested in us, in that they didn't mind us being there. They weren't scared of us, and they were just going about their manta business and feeding. And as I did a few more dives during that trip, I started to see that in some cases they actually are very interested, and they come a little bit closer, and they're curious, and they want to see what you actually are. And yeah, it was kind of very memorable diving experience for me, and I just wanted to learn more about them. So I just did a little bit of internet Googling and came across very quickly some information of how manta rays are actually in trouble, how they're being hunted to unsustainable levels, and how the populations are declining all over the world. So I said, well, if there's anything I can do, and I noticed that a couple of organizations were collecting photographs of manta rays in order to understand the size of the populations. So all you had to really do is share your photographs of the underside, the belly side of the manta. And because each manta has different spots on their bellies, basically, that they maintain for their entire life, you can identify them just by these spots. So because I had this magical encounter with over 100 individuals, and a lot of them were feeding. So many of my photos were actually taken from the bottom facing up. So I ended up having like 45 individual identifications when I went back and looked at my photos from my dive, like not even trying to collect data, just taking photos of the mantas, feeding. So that was like, oh wow, I've just had a really great day for data, and I submitted all these photos to the website that was collecting them. But yeah, so one thing led to another. My husband, he is a dive instructor, and he was really fascinated to also come back. So we looked for jobs and started working for one of the dive centers there. And on my spare time, I continued to kind of promote this citizen science way of helping research. And yeah, so that's kind of doing that for a couple of years, I decided that I wanted to get more serious about it, and actually went back to school. And yeah, so here I am.
Wow, that sounds amazing. I can imagine diving with so many mantas. Wow.
It was definitely a spoiled first encounter with that many. So yeah.
Wow, definitely. I love your story. So we are lucky enough to see the manta rays here in Nusa Penida almost
Yep,
all year long, as you know. And I want to ask you what attracts them to this place.
sure. So just going back to a little bit of my story, I started to put together a project for research in Indonesia, basically what would need to be looked into and what we didn't know. And one thing that we found out, so I have some colleagues who are also doing the same thing that I was doing in Komodo, but in Nusa Penida. And just serendipitously, we ended up comparing some of our photos of our mantas and realized that we had photos of the same manta, which meant that some mantas were actually making a very long migration of over 450 kilometers straight line from Bali to Komodo and vice versa. And that was really cool because at that time, that was one of the longer kind of movements that were recorded for mantas. And also, like, there was a couple of other studies that looked at continuous coastlines, for example, in Australia, and saw movements of over 600 kilometers, others around the coast of Africa. But this was different because it was an island chain, and we hadn't really seen large migrations through island chains like this. In fact, if you look in Hawaii, which is some of the other places where we know a bit more, there's, even though the distance between the islands, the Maui island chain are much closer, they haven't actually found any mantas crossing, between the islands. So for us, that was like, whoa, that's interesting. That's different. So it was cool for, just for understanding a bit more about the biology of the species and how they can actually have longer range movements than we previously thought. But at the time when mantas was still being hunted in Indonesia and simultaneously protected in some areas, like in the Nusa Penida Marine Protected Area and in the Komodo National Park, it was important to let the government and policymakers know that although protections in these different conservation zones are very important, we're missing protection because these mantas don't actually understand borders of conservation zones and they leave them. And right in between these two zones is actually one of the larger fisheries for sharks and rays in general. And even though mantas were in many cases seen there as a kind of desirable bycatch, like they weren't necessarily being targeted by many of the fishers, they were a very welcome kind of thing to find. So so basically around that very same time, Indonesia did want to start looking into better protections for their mantas for a number of reasons. There's an international treaty that Indonesia's a member to that had now listed mantas as a species that you no longer should be exporting across borders. And the reason why that's important is because one of the reasons manta rays were such a valuable catch is that they were being sold, or at least parts of them, for Chinese traditional medicine. So that kind of helped to, reduce export. But Indonesia also was looking at some economic studies that showed that manta ray tourism was actually quite valuable to the local population. It provides a lot of jobs and livelihoods for lots of people. And I actually worry now during COVID times how some of these people who are supported by tourism are faring. But anyways, hopefully it's something that doesn't last for long. So Indonesia wanted to do better and wanted to protect mantas for these economic reasons as well. And so they decided that because manta rays were clearly leaving these conservation zones, that they should have nationwide protection. So they did that in 2014, and that was a really big success story for many of the different groups working on manta ray conservation in Indonesia. So that was around the time that I was putting together my project. So it was clear to me that the populations were linked, and it was important to have a look at both. And another kind of threat that I started noticing was especially during the rainy season, was a lot of marine debris. And I had some friends share some photos of me in different parts of Indonesia, where during the rainy season, we started to see a lot of waste in manta ray feeding grounds. So that was kind of the other aspect of my studies, and another thing that I wanted to focus on. And the reasoning, besides for just finding out what the potential impacts were, is because manta rays had gained this kind of star status for conservation in Indonesia. There was a lot of pride within the local communities of, for manta rays, and, working with these magnificent animals, and how people come from all over the world to see them in their natural environment. So we thought that this might be a good way, if we start to document the impacts of plastic, especially the tiniest plastics, which manta rays are susceptible to ingestion or to eating because of their filter feeding lifestyles, basically just hoovering up water and selecting out plankton and unfortunately plastics, because they are sometimes in the same size range as plankton. We thought that if we raise awareness about this to local communities, that it could help to improve local waste management practices. So that was kind of the silver lining that I hope to grab onto with some of my research. So what brought me to Nusa, a long way of answering what brought me to Nusa Lembongan, is I wanted to study some of these threats to mantas there as well as just understand a bit more about how they use the area and why it's important to them. So initially I didn't know, but now, after spending a couple of years looking at it, it appears that Nusa Penida has two very important habitats for manta rays there. One appears to be a feeding habitat for very young stages of manta rays. So we see a lot of juveniles, a couple of sightings of what look like newborns, kind of using this area to feed. And another site not far off, only about 12, 13 kilometers along the same coastline, that's mostly used by adult manta rays, so the big females and bigger males, and they come in here for cleaning. So there's an area of coral, which a lot of smaller fish make home, and the mantas kind of swim over this area, and the fish come out and pick off parasites and dead skin from mantas and other large fish, basically cleaning them. So they are attracted to this area, but while they all come together there, a lot of people now are starting to think that this bringing together of adults helps them socialize as well, as a meeting point, if you have it. And we started also seeing that certain times a year, this place is fantastic for watching manta ray courtship behavior, which is just really amazing to see. It's very kind of fast-paced, and it's a large group of animals are just swimming together. And if you don't know what you're seeing, you could just be a little bit shocked, because you just see, what looks like a train, and actually we call it a mating train, of animals just swimming very quickly and changing direction and turning back around. And so we see that kind of behavior there, which again supports that social activity. So potentially it's not just a manta spa, but also kind of the bar and so forth. So yeah, Nusa Penida is actually a really special place for manta rays, and definitely piqued my interest to spend more time there and understand more about mantas.
What is your most fascinating experience so far encountering mantas?
To be the courtship kind of activity, and even just some silly little bloopers, if you have it. I've seen a male manta ray just going about his business and cleaning on a cleaning station, and another male coming in and just being confused and trying to do what we would think of as regular courtship activity. So when manta rays are courting, basically what happens is the male tries to sneak up onto if you imagine them kind of flat, sneak up onto the back of the female and grab onto usually her left pectoral fin and kind of spin themselves around, so they're belly to belly. So the reason why they grab their pectoral fin with, and they use their mouths to do that, is because that's the only thing that they can grab onto each other with. Then they can mate very similar way to the way that mammals mate, for example. And that's one of the ways that we can tell that females are mature, actually, is because a little bit of the protective coating on their fins gets rubbed off when the male bites onto the fin, and so we get what we call mating scars. We see little areas of their fins are kind of rubbed off, so we know that that female has been mating. But in this situation, it was two males, and then one of the males was trying to mate with the other one, and the other one was just like, "No, man, I think you're confused." So that was really funny. Yeah, and just during the courtship behavior, it's just very wonderful to be there. And sometimes I've seen mantas, the females, so basically what they're doing is they are trying to test the stamina and the endurance of the males. So they're at the lead of the train, and the males are trying to follow them so they can, do this sneak attack thing. But the female makes it often difficult for them, swimming quickly, changing direction. And after time, some of the males get tired or are unable to keep up, and they end up later down the line or just drop off completely, until finally there's like one or two that are staying until the end. And I've seen the females actually use divers as kind of pylons, and like, because when we're exhaling, we have bubbles that go all the way to the surface, so to them we actually look a lot bigger than we actually are, even though we're smaller than them. And they just kind of loop around us, and especially in the blue water, when they do that, is just amazing, because you just have this several ton fish just swimming at you, and you're like, oh my god, what's happening? And then they just go around you, and you just kind of sit there and just try to bring your arms and legs in and enjoy the ride and enjoy the show. So yeah, those are some of my most memorable moments, for sure.
Love your story. Thank you so much for sharing that.
Helping me remind some pleasant memories.
So what was your inspiration to start working in marine conservation?
I got involved through scuba diving, actually. My background as a scientist was very laboratory based: biochemistry, microbiology, a lot of microscopes, a lot of working with molecules, things that I cannot even see with my eye. So I started scuba diving as a hobby, and I realized that there's actually quite a lot that we don't know about our oceans, and a lot we don't know about the the animals that live there, even though we are starting to see that they're on the decline. So it just kind of motivated me to use my mental muscle towards this cause, and trying to build a bit more knowledge.
What is the most important discovery that you found out during your work here in Nusa Lembongan?
Well, I'll give you two. One of the more fun discoveries, but also important for the conservation of the species, is this area that we see quite a lot of the younger manta rays coming in to feed. And this is exciting because although there's been increasing amount of research and knowledge about manta rays in general from around the world, so far there's only been a handful of places where we can reliably record sightings with juvenile and young individuals. And we think that this is evidence that this is a manta ray nursery. And thus far, there's only been, basically just recently, there was another study that came out from our colleagues in the US, but basically 3 places that have been recorded in the scientific literature as potentially being manta ray nurseries. And one of them is in Nusa Penida. And there is some anecdotal evidence from other parts of Indonesia as well, but they haven't been kind of put through all the finalizing stages of peer review yet. But yeah, so it's an area worth investigating more. So starting to learn a bit more about, how long does it take for a manta ray to mature? How much does it grow every year? Because already they're born at quite a large size, but they're not by seeing them return to the same area and feed in this area, it tells us that they're not ready to forage for further offshore or go offshore to look for food the way that adults are, because they're continuously feeding and being seen in the same area until they start to reach a certain size or a stage of maturity, and then we see them less and less. So that means that this area is actually very important to maintain for the juveniles. And because manta rays have a really low reproductive output, so they give birth to one baby every 3 to 8 years, depending on which part of the world you're looking at. So it's very low. It takes them over 10 years to reach maturity so they can even start giving birth. And it takes them 12 months to carry that baby to term. So any area where, that's important for reproduction and also for the young to mature and grow is very important for the conservation of the species. And even though we spend a lot of time in the water with manta rays, we still don't know where they give birth. Nobody has ever witnessed it in the wild. We have one account from an aquarium, but we've never seen it in the wild. And the fact that we do see, juveniles and newborns coming into this area makes us think that, and then there's also the reproductive ground where the adults are mating, and we see quite a lot of heavily pregnant females there, that potentially around this coastline there might be a pupping ground. So this makes it very interesting. So something that we hope to look into further into the future. So that's the kind of happy story. The not so good story is that in the past couple of years, before a lot of the waste management initiatives have come into full force. So, as of 2018, the end of 2018, but implemented in the middle of 2019, there's a ban on a number of plastic items that we can use in Bali. So plastic bags, I hope that hasn't changed much since the pandemic, because I see here in Canada that, plastic waste is just horrible. But we were making some really good movements with reducing the amount of single-use plastic that's used in Bali. But before all these kind of strategies were put in place, we were seeing a lot of waste, a lot of trash, floating trash coming into this very same manta ray feeding ground, especially during the rainy season when we have the most of our rainfall and the rivers kind of depositing a lot of waste into the ocean. So unfortunately, we actually we estimated how much pieces of plastic the manta rays might actually be ingesting based on what was in the water and how much water we know manta rays ingest per hour of feeding. So we're looking into like over 60 pieces potentially being ingested per hour of feeding for the mantas there. And we have found some evidence of actual ingestion. So we work with the local dive community and we handed out little collecting tubes in case that anyone sees a manta ray pooping. It does happen, and you have to be very quick though, because it kind of disperses in the water. But if you're quick, you can get the clumps and you can just stick them in the tube. So a lot of our divers were carrying them in their BCD pockets just in case this happened. And afterwards, after their dives, they'd come to our little research station and say, "Oh, I got some manta poop for you." And so we looked through about 30 of these samples. To be honest, a lot of them were not enough to actually analyze, but we had a few good chunks. And in one of them, we found over 20 pieces of plastic. So that means that manta definitely ate it, and it definitely spit it out, and definitely was able to at least pass some of it out. But we do worry that some might have stayed inside the animal, or at least took its time making its way through, and that has some problems when it comes to the type of chemicals that plastic has, and some of them being very toxic. So we do worry that there are some toxicity effects on the mantas as well, and something we want to look into the future. But yeah, so that was the not so great discovery and kind of the wake-up call. But we're hoping that because like I mentioned before, manta rays are such a rock star in the conservation world in Indonesia, and such a source of pride, that kind of raising awareness with the local people will hopefully change some of these habits so that they can protect their own livelihoods, especially those that work in tourism.
You already mentioned microplastic. Can you tell us what is the biggest harm for manta rays and how can we as divers help to protect them?
Sure. So the main threat to manta rays still remains fisheries. So directed fisheries should now be outlawed in Indonesia, or are now outlawed in Indonesia, but sometimes illegal activity can still occur. But bycatch is still a very large problem. So even though you're not intentionally going out to get the mantas, certain types of fishing gear, gill nets, for example, long lines can very easily entrap not only mantas but turtles and other marine, like large marine megafauna. So it's important to consider our dietary habits. Are we eating fish? And if so, do we know how it was caught? Because the problem with, there's nothing wrong with eating fish per se, but if it's caught in an unsustainable manner, you might actually be eating more than just that fish. You might have, those mantas and those turtles and those dolphins that you're not actually eating, but because you are supporting an unsustainable type of fishery, then you're helping to, catch those animals in a way as well. So yeah, it's important to consider where your seafood's coming from, and if you don't know, don't buy it. There's lots of different certifications now with the Steward Council and others, and I know a number of Indonesian fisheries or tuna fisheries are trying to get those certifications, and it's starting to come, but yeah, look to support local small-scale fishermen who just use hand lines and are not fishing in conservation zones, I would say, if you're a fish lover.
What does your daily research life look like now at the moment during this pandemic, and do you plan to come back to Indonesia?
Yeah, so we have a lot of plans for different projects in Indonesia. I've got a little team there, and there's a lot of opportunities for them to grow as we start to learn more about mantas, and as we learn, more questions open up. So we have our long-term programs that we want to continue monitoring the animals in the area to make sure that populations are remaining healthy. We want to hopefully document a reduction in amount of plastic in these feeding grounds, because we have about 5 years worth of data now, so we can start to track trends over time. And we hope that these mitigation strategies, these waste management strategies in Bali are starting to pay off where it counts. So definitely would love to continue our research there if we can. So some of the problems besides for mobility at the moment, so our team is still in Indonesia, and I'm hoping to get back there myself so I can be more on the ground. It's at the moment we've just been doing Zoom meetings like this. We set up a couple of meetings a week. While we were in lockdowns, we were, instead of going out, we were looking through our data and just trying to process all the data that we had, and it really focused on what we can do to prepare for when we get back in the water. But I think the situation has maybe gone on a lot longer than most of us had hoped it would. And we are very dependent on small dollar donations, basically. So we have some funding that we get from larger donors, but a lot of that is only to fund things like purchasing equipment and materials, but not actually to support our operations and our staff. So a lot of that funding comes from small dollar donations and some businesses that fundraise for us, and a lot of those businesses are tourism businesses, and they are suffering themselves right now. As well, these same businesses support our our research by giving us in-kind support and allowing us onto their dive boats at no charge, so that we can go out and do the monitoring, collect that data that we need. And now, of course, with reduced amount of tourism, those opportunities are also limited for us. So this, I mean, you're going to see it for science all around the world, especially for conservation science and marine science, that 2020, there's going to be kind of like a big gap in data. But we hope that with, hopefully vaccines being developed or other mitigation strategies, that we can get back and continue the work that we're doing and continue on with our plans. So yeah, we're just all kind of holding our breath a little bit.
Yeah. Thank you so much for your time today, Ellie. We learned a lot from your research, and I'm sure our audience can use your knowledge as well to help to protect marine life. We hope to see you next time here in Bali, hopefully in person.